Good afternoon. My name is John Palfrey, and I hope everyone had a lovely lunch. Christia introduced me before as being a professor of law at Harvard, which is true. I didn't know that it conveyed such power on me that my old boss may go to the Supreme Court. This was a slightly surprising note, but it actually gave me a way to tee up this session. My old boss, who was named Elena Kagan, was the dean of the Harvard Law School. She's been proposed to be nominated by the President of the United States, Barack Obama, for the Supreme Court. And there are two versions of this nomination that I think tee up this next session on the power of data. The power of data, I think, brings us in some respects from the wonder and the extraordinary opportunity associated with the web brought to us by Sir Berners-Lee, who will be on this panel, but also some of the challenges associated with the free flow of data. Like any other revolution, there are good and bad things that come with it. When my Dean Kagan was nominated in this way, two things happened. One, the president went on YouTube and put the nomination video online so that everybody in America and around the world could be introduced to the Solicitor General, hopefully the next Supreme Court Justice. He sent out emails saying, join up, sign up, and say that this is someone you support, a very open government kind of thing. And on the other hand, the critics, the very few critics, she's quite extraordinary, of her nomination, said there was too little information about her in the world. We know too little about this woman, about what her positions will be on hot-button issues to nominate her to the Supreme Court. This is the most qualified possible, brilliant lawyer, extraordinary person who's been not only an academic, but amazing lawyer, a Solicitor General of the United States, dean of a law school. And the complaint was, we know too little about her. The expectation was that there should be more information, there should be more data about her. We'll get at this twin pole here in this next session between a utopian version of the world in which we know we can use these technologies to improve everything. On the other hand, the dystopic, where there's too much shared about us and something that we have to grapple with. To join us on the stage, I would invite Sir Tim Berners-Lee and company. Please welcome this extraordinary panel. Please. So, in keeping with the last few panels, we're going to have a few minutes each from this distinguished group, and then hopefully you will come up to the microphones and join in the debate, and we'll hopefully get some lively conversation going. We'll start with Sir Tim Berners-Lee, again, inventor of the web, as everyone knows. Someone who's also been working a lot on the wonder side of this equation, what it is that we can do with these technologies. And he's been thinking a lot about something called linked data. And I wonder if you could explain the wonder of linked data and where we're going. And then we'll turn it over to Maurice.
Okay, well, so data on the web is a bit surprising that we haven't been doing it for 20 years in a way. We've been doing documents on the web. We found documents on the web very exciting. When we see documents on the web, we follow links between them. But a lot of the things on a desktop, for example, are actually data. So a calendar file, for example, if I look at a calendar file, I don't read it. I use a calendar program to look at it, and the calendar program will allow me to look at it as a day view. I can look at it as a week view and a month view, and it'll allow me to merge with other data from other people's calendars. And without that, that's really the calendar file is pretty boring. There's lots of data. A lot of the things that are more exciting on the web now, in fact, there's data behind them, like the maps. So we hear that there are, thousands of deep oil rigs out there in the ocean. Okay, where are they? Give us the data. Give us the lat long and the depth, and that'll be really interesting. People will be able to see that. They won't look at it directly. They won't read the data. They'll put it through applications and websites and things. So there's a huge amount of value in data out there. About a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, in fact, we were invited for lunch with the British Prime Minister of the time, Gordon Brown, and at his country place. And he asked at one point, he said, OK, so if the UK is going to make the best use of the internet, what do we do? I said, well, you put your government data on the web. And he said, OK, let's do that. So that led to basically a 6-month project from the summer leading up to launch of a UK government sort of central data index, data.gov.uk, which involved building a really exciting developer team and putting data on the web. And the push for that, the reason why that's such a clear thing, and why it's a non-partisan thing, why everybody's so excited about it, is that this data has been sitting there on people's disks. It's got value. In fact, it's been made by some government department using taxpayer money it's valuable. It was made for one particular purpose. But actually, the interesting thing about data, unlike a web page, is that when you get data, it's actually much more interesting to you when you join it with some other data, when you compare it with the data from a completely different source. So if somebody makes a website out of the data and presents it to you, that's never going to be as exciting as what you can do if you can get hold of the data. So this extra value to the whole economy of the country and of the world is sort of sitting there untapped. So the idea was you put that data out there and people will use it for all kinds of things, and they put the data out there and people did use it for all kinds of things, and it happened in the US too. And of course Obama made his first memorandum was about being open, transparency, and open data. So there's been a big push, and it's been great to see this competition between the graphs, between the two governments competing across time to put more and more data on the web. So it's been very exciting. It's something everybody should understand the value of, and it's not just the UK and US, the other governments getting involved. And it's not just governments. It's scientific data. It's community generated. And of course, it's enterprise data. So if you think about just one data set in your company, it may be the data set of the parts that you have, that you're selling into the automotive industry or something. Or it may be the data of all the media clips which you've got for sale or rent. Is that data that you really want to keep secret? Is it data which, in fact, you want to get out to everybody? You want everybody to know about your product. So product data is stuff where it's really in your interest to get it out there. And you want sites to be mashing it up. Mashing up data is when people take data from different places, they put it together, and they give the user a new view of it. So somebody, maybe they're using all your TV data in a soccer site. And they only take the bits about soccer, but that actually is really valuable for the soccer people to be able to get at the clips of TV. So it's enterprise data. 2009, I used for explain to everybody that it's important to put data on the web, in particular to put government data, because that's really low-hanging fruit. We're not talking about personally identifiable information here, stuff that you want to be public. There's lots of, we'll talk about personally identifiable data, I'm sure,
already
anyway.
Shaking your head. There's going to be some good pushback here
Okay, but so I'm just saying, where it's not personally identifiable, where it's data that needs to be out there, then it's a wasted resource, wasted value, if you haven't put it out there, and we've got the standards to put it out there on the web now.
Sir Tim, and as a Yank, do I say Sir Tim? Is this the appropriate?
You can say Tim.
Tim is okay, that's good too.
Generally in America, I have the rule if you say sir, you have to buy a round of drinks, but that's
all right, well, we'll buy you a round of drinks in Cambridge. That sounds fun.
Over here, you should say sir, or you'll get your head chopped off.
When there's a chance to spend time with the inventor of the World Wide Web, I'll buy the round of drinks. But so I wonder if you could just take an example of the wonder that greets us out here in the hall. So we have the Android phone and connecting to the cloud, and then you've got the layer demo, which you may have seen, which is augmented reality on top of this phone and so forth. Is that a vision of linking data? Because I think often we think about this as text and hypertext links, but I wonder if there's a way to think about what you're describing and the future of AR that we've seen out in the hallway.
Well, so if you think about AR, it's about using the space. It's full of any augmented reality thing that you see is going to be constructed for you at the time to order. You're going to be looking at a particular physical place, and then superimposed on it are various things which are associated with the same physical place. Now, out there already in the web of linked data, there are out there lots and lots of things associated with different places. So you will find data about all the post boxes, and you might find data. You might even find some farmer has been streaming data about where all his GPS-controlled cows are. All kinds of stuff is out there. So probably you don't want to see all of them. So an augmented reality thing needs to filter, so you need to be able to control which things are displayed. So no, the augmented reality is not like watching a movie. It's constructed for you in real time out of data. In fact, behind most exciting things out there on the web, it's not just augmented reality, but just real maps, 3D views, Google Earth. Excellent. It's data. So yeah, it's just another example of where, that's one way of looking at data. Actually, interestingly enough, it's a way of looking at data by connecting it with position. And a lot of data we found from the UK government is really interesting if it's connected to data. And that's why there was a lot of push from us to get the Ordnance Survey mapping data available. So that was a really important step.
Excellent. And speaking of surveys, this is a good segue to Maurice Biriotti. This is someone who's a professor at multiple schools, but is also chairman and founder of SHM Productions, and someone who knows a great deal about what people think about sharing data about themselves and otherwise. Maurice, thank you so much for being on this panel. It's extraordinary to have you here as well. Maybe you can help bridge us from the sense of wonder, of course, about the web and why we share these data about ourselves and otherwise, through to some of the things that we ought to be mitigating by way of risks.
Yeah, I think the idea of a bridge is probably right. Well, I mean, when we hear a visionary like Tim talk, we get very excited. I get very excited about various possibilities, but I also know I feel like I'm in the eye of a storm here. On the other side, I can feel, you know, the voice of a kind of conscience that's coming that says, hang on a second, have we thought through all of the implications? I don't want to give a personal opinion here because that's not my role. What I want to do instead is to say what I found out from talking to people, because some time ago it became apparent to me that this was going to be a really important debate. The extent to which people feel comfortable, in particular, about data being spread around the place about themselves.
And I should note that this is all being webcast eventually on YouTube, right? Not in real time, but just if everybody comes up to the mic, it's an important disclosure, I think.
Well, then I don't want to take part then. Yeah. Sorry, I'm leaving.
He was going to say it anyway, but just in case you were aware.
Too late for some.
So you could be right off there. Anyway.
Protection issue.
Yes, no, I know that. I know that. I've just been put off what I was going to say. Anyway, one of the things that I wanted to find out was the degree to which people did or didn't feel sensitive about the use of their own information on the internet. And I suppose, a little bit like your bridging, there was a sort of two different views that were being put out there. On the one hand, people who said, the more we understand about people, the better we're going to be able to tailor products and services to them, and the better they're going to be able to use data, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other hand, there were people who were saying, well, hang on a second, isn't this a situation in which we're sleepwalking into a certain kind of disaster, in which people are going to know things about us that they're going to be able to use in unacceptable ways? Rather than getting into that debate, what I wanted to do was find out what people actually thought about it. One of the questions I had was, do people today, particularly people who've been through the internet revolution, those people who were described earlier as natives, do those people have a different or no sense of personal, secret, etc. data? And what we found out from talking to a lot of people was that actually there was still a very strong sense of the importance of some kind of protected information about oneself. And taking it away from the internet for a second, broadly, you could fit it into three categories. People didn't necessarily use these terms, but they had a really strong sense of it. Stuff that's secret, that I feel I need to keep secret. It could be a code that I use for my bank, or it could be some information that I just don't want other people to know. Stuff that's private, that's not secret. So for example, you know, at some stage today, I'm going to go to the bathroom. That's not a secret. Pretty much all of you are going to do something very similar. But it is private. And there's something very different about private and secret. And then there was this third category, which was terribly important for people, particularly in that generation, which I would call personal information, in which time and time again, what we heard was, I don't mind telling you about this stuff if you ask me, but I feel really weird about it if you know it before I've told you, or before, if you like, I've authorized you to know it. And it was in that last area that we found the most confusion for people. Now, when we took the debate outside the realm of just the general to the internet, what we found was that people's behavior often was as if they didn't have any of these concerns. They were gladly doing all sorts of things on the internet that suggested that they'd completely lost all of their inhibitions. Now, why was that? I mean, I could go on about this for some time, but there were some interesting things that people themselves said. One interesting thing that people pointed to was the fact that when you're using the internet, often you're doing it in a situation in which you feel like no one can see you. You're in your bedroom, for example. So this behavior that's very familiar to us of a kid on the internet, and he's writing all sorts of stuff on the internet, and then his mum walks in and he hides the screen. Actually, what he's doing on the screen is a hell of a lot more public than what his mum is going to see, but he's not necessarily aware of that because it feels to him like what he's doing is private. And if you look back in, even in literature, to right the way back to the Greeks, there is this very strong sense that people have of being able to contain yourself privately, but it's almost a physical act. The triggers for it are physical, and the internet breaks down those triggers, and therefore, I suppose, you might say, lulls us into a bit of a false sense of security. There are other things as well. There's a sense that people have that the information that's out there about people is so vast, so enormous, that no one's going to bother themselves finding out about me, so it doesn't matter. I might as well just put it out there, because no one's ever going to find it.
The privacy through obscurity theory, right?
Absolutely. And people said this regularly. There's also a sense that people have that, I suppose, part of our zeitgeist, to use an important word for today, part of our zeitgeist is the belief that somehow transparency is related to moral uprightness. The more transparent we are, the more moral we are. Not so sure that holds up to philosophical scrutiny, actually, but there's a belief almost that if you share everything, that must mean you have nothing to hide, and if you have nothing to hide, then why not just go for it? Within all of that, there is a real anxiety that people have, a real sense that when we asked people, so how do you feel about this? What they told us regularly was, I really wish you hadn't asked me the question, because now I've thought about it, I feel awful, and I'd rather go back to not knowing.
So Maurice, to take an old media example that maybe you can help situate in this context, as a Yank, I opened the Times this morning, I guess, and I learned about somebody I didn't know about, Lord T, who apparently had some troubles associated with the World Cup bid for England. And it was a conversation that he'd had with somebody who was presumably a confidant, then moved to another context, or in the context of this article, he described Gordon Brown in a comment about somebody bigoted and so forth. So does this fit into your story?
Bigoted.
Allegedly, sorry. How does this fit into the story that you're telling here?
I think it does tangentially. I suppose we're living in an age in which we believe somehow that anything that can be broadcast is fair game, and that somehow if we open everything up, then everything will be much easier, will be fine. I suppose I worry about that for a number of different reasons, partly because not only bad impulses, but also good impulses are sometimes kept quiet. About 30 years ago in this country, if a politician had been found quietly having a conversation with another politician about the fact that he or she thought that civil unions between gay people ought to be allowed, that may have been the end of their career. I suspect conversations like that were going on. And today, that's now part of mainstream politics. So I worry a little bit that the equation that says open always means moral or good is something that may be throwing away something essential. And I say that just not from my own point of view, but also because it's what people repeatedly talk to us about. The anxiety that actually all of this openness, once you start to think about it, might have consequences that we're not fully aware of.
Excellent. I think it's a perfect segue to Shami Chakrabarti. Shami is the director of Liberty and a lawyer by training, I understand it. And I know you'd like to respond in part to some of what Sir Tim has to say, but I wonder if I could pose it slightly a different way, and I'm sure you'll get around to the critique, which is that let's imagine that we embrace a lot of the wonder here in terms of what the web enables us to do, that digital media allow us to do. We embrace the possibilities of linked data. What are the things that we need to think about? Is it possible to build into either the architecture or our sensibilities a way to have a public sphere in which we can live as human beings and flourish while also have the benefits of these technologies?
Well, thank you. Yes, I do think it's possible, but first we need to have a conversation about what is and is not desirable. It's a great pleasure to be here, by the way, and the skillful way that you handled that segue probably stopped the explosion that was otherwise sort of about to happen. I think perhaps that, and it's a great privilege to be here with Sir Tim, by the way, but I think here's the difference between us. I think a scientific genius and an entrepreneur begins with the proposition, we can, and so we must. Whereas an ethicist or a lawyer in recovery like me, or a human rights campaigner, or I hope a democratic politician, says we can, but should we? And I think that you know, it is, you know, civilization is partly driven by the great, you know, technological engine and revolution, but there needs also to be ethics and law and humanity to temper that driver, because what we want, surely all of us, is the great apparent benefits of any technology, and there have been other revolutions before this one, without the worst of the drawbacks. And we want to make sure, and I think this hasn't always happened in recent years, we want to make sure that the ethical, legal, human, political discourse catches up with the technological discourse and advancement before it's too late. And I think that one of the reasons why it's a pleasure to be here is that often we're talking about silos of professional expertise, where I'm sure that Tim was fairly unaware or oblivious to the shockwaves that he was sending down my spine with talk about taking all this government data and just putting it out there on the web. Yeah.
Not personally identifiable.
Well, you said that right at the end, if I may say, after, after some mutterings in the room, and that's the proposition. You talked about your conversation with Gordon Brown. Let's be clear: there is a new government in a new coalition government in Britain at the moment, and you can take your bets on how long that lasts. But one of the things I find fascinating about this new coalition and this moment in British political history is that a coalition that some people thought was unlikely has to a large extent tied itself together with the language of civil liberties. And you could argue, and I would argue, that one of the ways in which the previous government lost an element of public confidence and trust, just one way, I'm not saying it's the crucial vote-winning issue, but it is an issue that affects the flavour of society, came in relation to compromises to fundamental rights and freedoms, and actually personal privacy in particular. Those massive data losses of sensitive government data. And so I would, so actually, if I'd been in the room, I've had other conversations with government, but if I'd been in the room, I would very much have been counselling caution and saying, decide what you want to do first, and then decide the whiz-bang technology that you're going to use to achieve it, rather than putting the cart before the horse. Because of course, and as a campaigner, of course, the World Wide Web has been a wonderful, levelling, democratising technology that makes it easy for campaigners in one part of the world, perhaps a very closed part of the world, to access information and contact with people on the other side of the world. That's all wonderful. But there is a dark side too. And the dark side can be that slightly illustrated before about how you think that forever seems like a very short time, that things that you do in the privacy of your room aren't actually being done in a private place at all because you are willingly complicit in the giving up of your personal privacy. But also there are forces at work, be they terrorist forces, be there business interests that aren't necessarily interested in the long-term happiness of their consumers, be they just negligent governments who can really use sensitive information. And it may not seem, the point that you made, Tim, about one piece of data can seem innocent, unimportant, until you put it together with lots of other data. That's an exciting prospect, but also a terrifying one in terms of the capacity to undermine the dignity, intimacy and trust that is essential to human relationships, human relationships on the small scale, but democratic society itself. There would be no secret ballots without personal privacy. There would be no fair trials without confidential access to your counsel, and it goes on and it goes on and it goes on. And the web has to be probably better understood and, if possible, regulated by people who care about fundamental rights and freedoms and not just about excitement and money.
So, Shami,
thank you.
Thank you.
We've got
Thank you. That's good interactivity from the audience.
Excitement and money.
I promise Sir Tim will get a chance to respond. I want to get all the way down through Fitz, and then I promise you get the next word. But Shami, just a short follow-up. Yeah. Much to the credit of the Zeitgeist organizers, we started the day with the Archbishop Tutu, who brought an ethical dimension to the room off the bat. It was morning prayer in a way, right? It started us from the ethical perspective and brought us into the political and business conversations. Is there a basic ethical principle that you believe we should be starting with as businesses around the room, praised by the Archbishop as good, decent people, before beginning to think about linked data? If you were to start from an ethical perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, I think privacy, you know, the doctrine of personal privacy, as now recognised in international human rights conventions and local conventions and various constitutional documents all over the world, is a pretty good place to start. This data isn't just out there to be mined like a free and natural resource. It belongs to people. And put together, it has the capacity to do, obviously, you know, great good. You know, the medical research that will cure cancer, but also has the capacity to do great harm. And so when you use people's data by compulsion, as the government often does, which is why government data is so sensitive and not just a free-for-all, or when you use it by stealth or by accident. And we heard, you know, a story involving Google just in the last couple of days about, I'm sure, a completely innocent accident in relation to taking more data than should have been taken. You can just see the capacity for error there. You've just got to be very careful about the purposes, about the knowledge that people have as to what you're doing, the contract, if you like, but also the purpose to which you put it. And in Britain, at least, we had a long-standing constitutional convention that data taken for one purpose will not be used for another without, you know, frankly, judicial warrant or a great degree of public consent. And I feel that the technology has moved apace and the politics and the regulation has yet to catch up. But the public do care, and catch up we will.
Excellent, thank you. And the last of our four panelists, Brian Fitzpatrick, who is an engineering manager at Google, but is also the person who came up with an extraordinarily important initiative at Google, the Data Liberation Front. Fitz, I want to put it in the context of an honest assessment of Google's privacy from the perspective of a user and somebody who observes your company, with due respect to our hosts. I think there are sometimes when I admire deeply what's going on, and sometimes one is puzzled or concerned, right? So in the puzzled and concerned zone, the feedback from the Buzz product or the disclosure over this weekend, again, may be perfectly well-intentioned, but certainly gives people pause. On the other side, the introduction of the dashboard, I think, is a remarkable thing. I've been working on the Global Network Initiative, where I think your company has taken an extraordinarily important stand in places around the world around internet-based surveillance. So I think it's a company that seems to be seeking to do the right thing, but is in an extraordinarily hard position. I wonder if you could help situate the Data Liberation Front in the context more broadly of what you're trying to do at Google.
Thank you very much. I think the context in which it comes into play with regard to privacy is one that when you use a company, especially software as a service or anything, you're giving your trust to that company. You need a way to revoke that trust. If your data is locked in or held hostage, there's no way to do that. And we're coming to a very different time where the same sort of thing's happening, but in a different semantic fashion, I would say. Years ago, I would perhaps have my data on a floppy disk. A couple years ago, I'd probably have it on my laptop or a workstation. Now you might have it on a flash drive hooked to your keychain. Today and tomorrow, what we're looking at is your data being stored somewhere in the cloud, and somewhere a software as a service, whether it's Google or another company or corporation. Now, I think we're all familiar with the various ways of companies locking users in. Right? The most obvious one is the contract. You maybe have a 2-year contract to utilize a product. Data formats have been used as a way of locking users in the past. Simple training, learning how to use any product is a way of locking people in. What we're looking at now is a new way of locking people in, and that's holding your data hostage. Okay? And I'm talking about data here. I'm talking about your personal data that you might create or import into a product. These may be your documents. These may be your emails. These may be your personal photos. But when you're relying on someone else for the storage of this information, you're embodying a certain amount of trust in them that they are going to, A, not lose it or have it deleted on accident, but B, that you can actually get it out again, that you still have some modicum of control over that data. And that comes in 2 fashions. One is the ability to make a copy out of their systems, and 2 is to delete that data. And so what the Data Liberation Front's goals are, and the name is a bit of an homage to Monty Python, not to be confused with the front of Data Liberation. But our goal is to started off, we looked at our products as a company and took an honest look at them. And while we realized the door wasn't locked in all these cases, in some cases it was stuck a little bit. And we thought that we could work to improve that. And I think the first inclination in that case is to sort of improve it through public relations. Show people how great everything is and how lovely this current situation of the stuck door is as opposed to the locked door. And our attitude was to take an engineering team and go to each product and work to actually, through technological means, make it easier for users to, with hopefully the single click of a button, take all of their data and export it as well as import it. Because import's always a great interest of companies because getting people to use your data. But the export thing is something that's thought about less. And what we found is that in general, we've sort of taken on raising awareness of this on an internet-wide level because people don't typically think about this before using a product. People might ask, what's the cost? How long has this company been around? How long are they going to be around? And what are maybe the privacy policy? What is the access policy? That sort of thing. But people don't typically ask, can I get a copy of my data out and go elsewhere until the moment in which they want to leave. And that moment might be a non-stressful moment where you just decide you want to copy your data for backup purposes. You might find another product somewhere that's a better product for you to use. But it might be a situation where the company's going out of business or where they have decided to discontinue support for your product. Or, to tie it back around to what you led me in with here, you've reached a point where you no longer trust that company and you wish to revoke that trust. It's a lot harder for you to do that if you don't have control over your data. And so, rather than boring people with engineering speak, when someone asks me why this matters, the analogy that I use is one that everyone is pretty much familiar with, is that of renting an apartment. Okay, so let's say that you're renting an apartment here in London and you find another apartment that's bigger, it's cheaper, and it's got a better view. Now I understand that's completely impossible, right? But work with me for a second here. So you call your landlord and you say, my lease expires in 2 months. I'm not going to be renewing. I'm going to need my security deposit back. And your landlord says, that's fine. You've been a great tenant. I want to remind you, however, when you leave, that you need to leave all your family photographs and your books and your furniture in the apartment. Okay? What are you going to do? Are you going to leave all that stuff? Odds are you're going to wind up staying for another year. But you're going to wake up every morning, you're going to stick 20 photographs in your jacket pocket, a book in your back pocket, and you're going to call up your friends to come over at 3 in the morning to move your couch out the back door. This is an important issue that you can actually do this, that you think about this in the context of your data, the same way you might think of it as your property, as a physical object that you can touch. And I think this is important from a business point of view. This isn't, you talked about the open and transparency as a moral issue. This isn't a moral issue. This is a business decision because we've reached a point in the world where trust, because switching costs are so low, where trust is becoming really important. And that if you want someone to come back and use product B next week, a new product of yours, if they want to leave product A this week, that experience needs to be a good experience.
So Fitz, how will you know if the data liberation front has been successful? What's the definition of success? And after that, I want to come back to Sir Tim.
I think the real success, well, I think one of our success metrics is raising awareness in general and getting people to think about this before coming into a product. The other success metric on a more technical level, I think the simplest way we put it is just a single push button to export all of your data. So and that there wouldn't be an extra charge for that either.
I, as a user of a Google service, will have a way to press a button and export my data into some format that I can use, which does not leave it on the original servers or in the cloud.
Right, and if it's not necessarily a format like you talk about calendar data, which you can directly read or something, it needs to be an open format that can easily be imported into another service. That's the current goal. I think down the line, I think we're going to see more interesting usage of liberating data, of transferring data from one service to another, providing data access from one product in your company to another company, as opposed to syncing and copying your data around. But there's quite a long ways to go before we get to that. But I think it ties in very importantly to the way the web was born, right?
Mm-hmm.
When Google first started.
Thank you for the segue, coming back.
When Google first started, Larry and Sergey didn't need to negotiate a contract with the internet to a search engine, right? This open platform has provided an incredible amount of innovation. And what we've seen happen in the last 20 years has been absolutely incredible because we've had this open platform. And I think it's a key element of maintaining this platform in an open manner.
Excellent. So I hope that some of you who are on your BlackBerries right now or otherwise would be willing to stand up and come and have a question. You'll be sharing a little bit of yourself with the world on YouTube, but I hope you'll do it and tell us who you are. But in the meantime, as a last comment before going out to the group, Sir Tim, so we've been thinking about there's a utopian version of the web, there's a dystopic one, we've all agreed there's something in the middle. How do we come to this kind of sustainable way forward, to think about a way that we can have the wonders of the web without...
Go back to my exploding commentator. I think there are 3 things I need to say.
Good, say them.
I've been accused of being a narrow geek who doesn't think about the ethical issues. And so I'm going to come back to... we need to talk about whether, in fact, there is public data or not, perhaps. And we also need to like to say something about personally identifiable data. When it comes to being a geek, I call myself a web scientist. I think the web science is something which I'm one of the half a dozen people who try to start web science in order to point out that people should look at the social as well as the technical aspect, and that everybody involved, whether they're on the social side, whether they're a recovering lawyer, or they are a social scientist, or an anthropologist, or a psychologist, or a mathematician and complexity theorist, or a network scientist, or a hacker, should all think about all the other issues. So web science is something in the field, and I'd welcome you to it. And because I think that, as you say, it's very, very important to look at all these issues. And if you come to look to MIT and look at what the students were doing, some of them have, for example, under Danny Weitzner, have been looking at accountability in building systems which help people to use data appropriately, and I think that's part of the answer. Danny has now, of course, got sucked into the Obama administration
in the best possible sense at NTIA, right?
And where he is helping write policy. So he's somebody who is, in fact, a lawyer, while he actually has done some amount of hacking, too. So the people I work with reckon to be very much on these sides. I can imagine if you've worked only with ethicists and people, and lawyers, you may tend to narrowly feel that all data is private identifiable data. And the moment I say data, you may think, private data. And we have on this panel 3 people who are experts in personally identifiable information and what you do and don't do with it. But do let's remember that when you say we should have a rule that if you have taken data for one purpose, you should only use it for that purpose, does that apply to the bus timetable? Does that apply to the data you've got about the behavior of a particular chemical? Does it play to the weather data? Does it play to the data about the oceans? Does it? So there's a huge amount of data out there, and one of the things I want people to go away with is that they can talk about using that huge amount of data which is not personal identifiable, and they should reuse it to the max, without somebody. Often what happens when you talk about data, somebody immediately jumps up and makes the same assumption you do. Oh no, we can't. You can't put data on the web without talking to our legal department, without talking to our ethical department. And in fact, so obviously sometimes there is a fuzzy line where you realize that actually if you put information out about those schools, because those schools some of them only have 2 teachers, if you put out the budget, you'll end up putting up. So there's a line where you have to be careful. But there's some area with a lot of scientific data which doesn't involve people, and it's really important to get it out there. And so I'd like you, put another hat on to sometimes spend some time pushing that out too. So there's large amounts of non-personally identifiable information. When it comes to personally identifiable information, I must say I've tried to give more or less, not perhaps in exactly the same words as the speech you just gave, myself when there was a committee in the UK Parliament was looking at the issue of deep packet inspection. And I feel very passionately about very many of the things you said, particularly that if you run deep packet inspection is something that an ISP can run, and I hope Google as an ISP doesn't run it, which you can do to actually look at all the packets going over a wire and work out what somebody is doing by putting them all back together, by reassembling them. You can figure out what somebody has clicked on. You can see the URL they went to, and you can look to see all the words that came back and build a profile of that person, or at least the people in that family, and so you can give them targeted advertising. Or you can find out whether they're terrorists, or you can find out whether they may, whether you should change their insurance premium because they may be suffering from cancer, or they may have clicked on something about cancer. It's a very, very powerful technology. It's something which I think it should be, we should, if we don't have an ethical understanding among all the ISPs that it's absolutely a no-no to store that information, then we will have to have possibly legislation.
So Shami,
About personal information, I feel very passionate.
This is good. Excuse me for 1 second. I just want to encourage some people to come to the mic so you can have a word and then we'll take a question.
We can argue while you form a queue.
Please form some queue.
Okay, we can do 2 things at once here.
There is plenty of that. Please come forward. Don't be shy.
Tim, I was going to say that I welcome that, but just as you want the technologists to have the kind of ethical understanding that you describe, I think some of us on the other side of the fence have been very, very slow to understand the potential implications of some of these technologies. That's why Fitz is music to my ears, because he's the techie person who can speak plain English and draw the analogy between the bedsit and the personal photographs and the and internet use.
Excellent. Please tell us who you are and have at the panel. Yes, sir.
I'm the first one on the very long line, Andreas Fiedels, Axel Springer Media. You were all talking about if there is enough privacy and secrecy on the internet. I was wondering about
which one is it, Chris?
Not much privacy and confidentiality on the internet with regards to the internet being used for sometimes false allegations, false information, false rumors. That are being spread by people who are not identified. 95% of the communication on the web is from anonymous sources. So
is that an empirical statement, or? Yeah.
Is that not at least the biggest issue as the other one?
Can you mail the moderator with the data behind that statement, but the 95%?
Yes, I don't know.
I'm going to take it as a rhetorical statement that a fair amount said on the internet is anonymously said. But Maurice, would you care to respond?
Well, I'm always coming from the place of trying to understand how people feel about this stuff. And I must say that while I understand that, I don't think when you talk to people, they consider that to be the kind of peril that we've just been talking about before. So by comparison with the issue of, is my stuff safe, and the kind of stuff that Fitz was talking about, that doesn't seem to be as big an anxiety. Does that mean that it's not a fundamental question? Well, I don't know that 95% of the stuff is but I think it's not just a statistical issue. I think it's something one really needs to examine, whether it is as big an issue as you point out. I don't know.
Others on the panel care to respond?
I think that the question of whether to allow anonymous contributions in any forum is really interesting. I've seen a huge amount of damage done by people being very unscrupulous and lying anonymously in online fora. And I think within the World Wide Web Consortium, if you come to the W3C and you join off groups where you discuss the new technology and you build new standards, I don't think that you need to be able to come anonymously. So you come with an identity. I think that, on the other side, I know some people feel that in a democratic society where there can be pressures from employers, for example, when, that you need some sort of a whistleblower clause where, as a last resort, if somebody feels they're being persecuted and they're in danger, that they can do something, effectively spray things on the wall. And I think maybe that is true. You need to have some last resort anonymous complaint, but it's not part of the normal process. It only happens when rights have been violated very severely, and most of the time, and in a lot of things like public political discourse and building standards, it's reasonable to ask people to have some kind of identity. But it's a really difficult. There's no simple answer to that one that I found.
Fundamental and important. Fitz, last comment, then we'll come here.
And I think, anonymous or not, I think that no amount of technology currently replaces the need for personal discernment when you're reading any sort of data on the web. Whether it's anonymous or not, you need to be able to read between the lines, so to speak, as to the truth of the data and the source of it and the research behind it, like you talked about, perhaps.
Shami, I gather you'd like to jump in.
If you were to Google me, and you would probably find all sorts of references. Some of them, some of them kind, some of them really quite.
Moderators occasionally do this about panelists.
Yeah, some of it kind, some of it less kind, some of it racist. And some of, let's be honest, some of the nastiest things that would be said about me on the internet come under the cover of anonymity. But but sticks, to some extent, I say sticks and stones. To echo the point that was made here, on balance, I'd be more worried about compromises to sensitive personal data about me or my family that I had chosen to keep private than I would be about the kind of mischief that as well as the whistleblowing and the positive benefits of anonymity. In the end, if someone was using the cloak of anonymity to compromise respected sources, possibly Wikipedia or whatever, then ultimately we have to go to those respected sources and say, do you want to play this way? Do you want to encourage a forum that works in this fashion? But on balance, just as I would never have advocated printing presses only be issued to people under named license, I would never advocate that the internet should only be available to people who can be readily identified.
Maurice, last word on this, then we'll go to the question.
I was going to say, one of the interesting things was when we talked to people about a range of these kinds of issues that we're talking about now, these sort of moral issues, something that came up repeatedly from people was, look, with some of this stuff to do with our personal privacy, we know it because we're taught it at our mother's knee. We're taught it, but in public we know what we can say, how loud our voice should be, how loud our voice shouldn't be, etc. We kind of know when we should go behind a pillar when we want to do something, or when we should stand in public. We kind of know this stuff. We also know how to, because we're taught at school, how to read some of the traditional forms that we have available to us. So we're taught, even rudimentary teaching of history teaches us how to read historical sources, how to read a newspaper, etc. And then we're confronted with all this stuff on the internet. And why didn't someone teach us more about it? And I think that was something that came up repeatedly in the conversations we had with people. This sense that perhaps the best antidote to some of these moral perils is greater consideration of these topics. And people were hungry for that kind of debate. So I'm delighted to hear you talking about web science and the importance of getting ethicists involved in it, etc. But I think it's not just about groups of people in faculties and universities. I think it's getting this stuff out into schools and really starting to get people to understand some of the issues we're talking about.
And maybe on the data liberation front, right?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Sir, please. Tell us who you are.
Gavin Ailes from Trade Doubler. I'm a little embarrassed because this is a question for Google. And according to the tag here, it says that your name is Brian Fitzpatrick, and everyone keeps calling you Fitz. So I'm not quite sure. Is it Brian or is it Fitz?
Either one's fine.
Okay, Brian.
Depends on the question, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's not anonymous either way.
You talk about one of your tasks being to raise awareness about data management. Right now, Google uses user-generated content in order to deliver relevant advertising messages. Two questions, really. One is, how well do you think Google how good a job is Google doing right now to let people aware of how they're using their data? And the second question would be, in the spirit, as you mentioned, of sort of one-click removal of data, do you envisage a time when Google would allow sort of a one-click removal of the permission to use user-generated content, say, for instance, to deliver advertising messages?
Let's take the first question first. I think that actually, can you repeat the first question? I'm sorry.
Okay. First question is,
what grade would you give Google?
How good a job is Google doing at letting people know how it's using their data?
I think we've done a lot of really innovative things around that. The first thing we've done, I think, is our privacy dashboard. For one, we sort of given you a view in all the data that you're storing in Google in one place, which I think is really important because a lot of people, when they first went to this, they didn't realize, and like you said before, there's someone who didn't want to know this type of stuff, right? They don't want to hear that. But I think it's important to provide a good level of transparency into that. I think the second thing is, again, another innovative thing, I think, on the interest-based advertising. When we launched that, not only did we launch the ability to completely opt out of it, but we also launched a browser plugin, where you could permanently opt out of it. So if you cleared your cookies or something like that, it wouldn't remove the ability to be tracked. But just giving users that ability, that sort of, again, it's about control, right? We're pushing control back to the users there. And I think we discovered that for every 15 people who go and look at that screen on interest-based advertisement, I believe it's 10 of them do nothing. They just take a look at it and say, okay, that's what it is. It's fine. 4 people edit the categories. perhaps add some, perhaps they remove them all, whichever they choose, and then 1 out of 15 actually disables it entirely, and that's okay. But I think the lesson you learn from that is that it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. It's better to give people control, have the transparency, give them the knowledge and understanding, so that they can make the decision on whether or not they want to use it, utilize that.
Maurice talked about the whole, people not wanting to know, and that please don't tell me how much people are looking at me because it's going to scare me. So those things that you described. So going back to my question, is that good enough?
Because I was always very clear. When people say they didn't want to know, I don't think they were saying, I'm not interested, I don't want to know. I think I was saying, oh my God,
yeah,
I don't
that's
want
what
to
I mean.
know.
That's what I mean.
Just to be clear, that's a
different
very
form
different.
of, I don't want to know.
Exactly.
Yeah, no.
It's sort of, now that you're bringing me face to face with this, I realize what I've been doing. And because I love the wonder of what it is that I'm doing, and because I can see no alternative but to engage in this kind of, apart from unplugging, which is unthinkable to me, I would rather not know. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a thirst for the knowledge.
No, completely.
It means that they're very anxious about it.
No, completely. But the fact that they don't know would suggest to me that they're not being put in front of that fact clearly enough.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's partly inevitable because there is a trade-off between privacy and commercial interest here. Otherwise, people wouldn't be in this marketplace to some extent. But what I hope is that in addition to regulation where it's possible, which is, and there may be limits to that given the global phenomenon that we're talking about, and in addition to people just becoming more educated about what's happening, which is incredibly important. You talked about schools and so on. I worry about a sort of missed generation of already taken intimate pictures of themselves on their mobile phones and uploaded them that will be there forever. But sorry, just can I finish a sentence?
You may.
In addition, I hope that ethical, long-term interested companies will start seeing a commercial value in privacy as well as in transparency, and realizing that if you're in the marketplace for a long time, trust is so precious that it's worth doing what he advocates, because you'll actually build a market that will stick with you for a lifetime.
Sure, Tim.
Totally agree with that. I'd throw out for people concerned about getting things being more apparent, more in front of users. I throw a challenge to you. Try to sit down and try to design the web page you'd like to see. Try to, when you're putting in your shout, or you're saying that somebody's your friend, or you're communicating to a group, where would you like it to be? What form would you like it to be? A pop-up? Would you like it to be icons? I think there's a huge challenge in allowing somebody to do Facebooky things. And at the moment you can shout, you can say something, put something on your wall or on somebody else's wall, and you can select who's going to see it. I thought about having color schemes so that I can at every point have a different background color for different specific groups that I have. And I'd like to be able to actually have a few policies which determine who has access to it, what they're supposed to use it for, and things. And maybe I should use colors, or maybe I'd want to use icons, but maybe that would be too geeky for some people. The actual challenge of doing user interface that allows you to actually do your work and do all the networking you want to do at the same time as being aware is not simple. So if you manage to design that, you've made a huge step forward. And often, I don't think you can blame people for making it too visible or making it get in the way too much until you've actually come up with a better design yourself.
With apologies for cutting you off, Shami. What I wanted to jump in with excitedly was my own research, which in part is along the lines of what Don Tapscott was talking about earlier about young people, and just to raise the issue of the lost generation. In talking to young people, much as Maurice does, I found the opposite, actually. I don't think this is a lost generation in the making. I think these are actually young people who care a great deal about their privacy. They care about privacy from their parents and privacy from their teachers. It's slightly different context for it, and they don't necessarily have all the skills that they need, hence education, nor do they have the ability in every context to be able to do what they want in terms of the controls. But I don't fear, actually, for a lost generation, because it's just as Maurice said, that when people, I think, get pushed and introduced to the facts, that in fact they get quite engaged and animated in the process. We have to fix the structural setup, whether it's legal, regulatory, educational, technological, and so forth, but I think that there's promise there. Please go ahead, then I'm going to go to the chief scientist for BT, is anxiously waiting back here to ask
I was just going to say that I think that education is really important when it comes down to this, because 20 years ago, no one of us, or certainly not me, had the opportunity to go and click and say broadcast to the world, right? And so that's educating people on the impact that that can potentially have is pretty important, I'd say.
JP, tell us who you are.
John, I'm JP from BT. There seems to be this continued conflation between sort of personally identifiable data and linked data that is not of any personally identifiable value. But surely the common element between the two is asymmetric access. What should really worry people is if you don't know who is able to use your data and for what purpose, because that's when all the dark side of these things come through. And then if you just look at what's happening on the personal side alone, we're entering a stage where the rules are not going to be that simple, because we now have access to information about who's been looking at our information. And they don't necessarily know that we can see them. Okay? So now whose privacy do you actually start protecting? When someone looks at my LinkedIn profile, do I have the right to protect someone from seeing it? In that case, why the hell did I put it there? And if I did put it there and I have some benighted sense of privacy after I put it, do I then have the right to have somebody else who looks at it become known to me? So we're now seeing nesting in the privacy world as people move on. And I think that the sooner we move the debate to symmetry of access being open and not evil, and any form of asymmetric access leading to danger, whether it's public or personal data, the more we're going to solve this problem. Today, we're fighting public versus private too quickly. It should be symmetric versus asymmetric.
Wonderful.
I just wanted the panel's comments on that.
That's excellent. I might just take the liberty of asking this gentleman to ask a question as well, and then a few final comments. And we've got a Nobel laureate coming up next, so I want to honor the time.
Okay, mine's just a quick one. My name's Simon Walker. I work for a company called Maidthorn Partners. We advise creative industry companies. And our research over the last 6 months told us a very interesting thing, which is that the majority of web users who click to accept a privacy policy, when asked, they think that means the company is protecting their privacy. They think it is as simple as that. So a suggestion in this field might be, if we encourage websites to say, not our privacy policy, but our exploitation for commercial ends of your personal data, that might encourage the awareness that everyone's been talking about.
It's an interesting suggestion. I'm not sure how quickly that'll be adopted around the room, but it's provocative in any event. Maybe we'll start with Fitz, come down the line, a couple last words, and then we will wrap it up.
Well, I'm a little worried about giving this answer since I'm on a panel with a couple of lawyers here, but I think the onus on that privacy policy is a great example of obfuscation in legalese in a lot of cases. How many people read the click-through acceptance of terms of use or a privacy policy? And the answer is zero. And I think that the burden is on providers to provide. You can provide the legal document if you wish, but at least provide a document in plain English that your average layman can use. When the Google toolbar first came out a couple years ago, it had an option where you could click to see the page rank of any page you went to visit, which was fascinating to many people, myself included. I wanted to see what page rank my web page had. But under that, before you click that on, it said, before you click this button, read this information. This is going to send the URLs back to Google. This isn't the usual yada yada, I think it said, which caught your attention because it said yada yada in this thing.
Could a lawyer really have let that through?
Right, exactly. Somehow it snuck by. But I think that to summarize, I think it's important to put things in a plain English.
Thank you. And to cite Shami, I'm glad that Google has someone who speaks such great human, in fact, to explain all this to us. It's
no, I think that's right, and I completely agree with your point about it's a very defensive strategy to say we've got this lengthy legal document called a privacy policy, therefore we're okay. It would be much more proactive to be part of the constant conversation and education and warning system for these people you want to take with you as a company for their whole lives. On the point about asymmetric and symmetric access, I think that's a really valuable point. And of course, we would all feel comfortable, much more comfortable than we often do, with lots of data, whether it's held in the public or private sector. I agree that line is blurring all the time in terms of its importance. But I don't think that symmetry by itself gets you all the way, because we can all conjure up all sorts of situations where you know that the data is out there, you know who can see it, but it's still data that can be put to a purpose that is not quite what you'd hoped or intended.
It's very well put. Power still matters even when you have the information. Yeah. Maurice, last words.
I don't know if I share the concern exactly about a lost generation, but I do share a concern about a lost opportunity for a debate. I think when we go and talk to people about this stuff, they really, really want to talk about it. And I think there aren't enough opportunities to talk about it in plain English, simply, and allow people to join in that discussion. It seems strange that the internet that was supposed to be all about the democratization of access to knowledge has created its own sort of funny sets of legal and technical language that are preventing people from talking about some of the stuff that is actually the most important stuff in their entire lives. And I just, finally, just to talk about the fact that a lot of the people that we spoke to were pretty clear that one of the reasons why they put a certain amount of trust in the institutions that run the internet, or seem to them to run the internet, like Google, is because they think they're nice people. And I don't know, maybe they are.
I've met a few nice ones today.
Yeah, they seem quite nice, yeah. But they all ask themselves the question, what if they weren't? And that's a question that ought to preoccupy us a little.
Excellent. Sir Tim, last words, truly last words.
So I'll point out a couple of people who would be really good to have had here. Dana Boyd, Danny Weitzner, both point out another direction. That is, it's not just a question of who you let get at data. We can't anymore, in fact, really talk about not letting people get data, because you get information. I'm talking about personally identifiable information about people from various different ways. But we should maybe think more about what sorts of use it's allowed for. That was so JP said, and how it's used, and that's key in a way. I think when people put some photographs of the parties they did on vacation onto Facebook, there's an expectation when they release it to their friends that that's going to be they're going to look at it to see that they had a good time and to enjoy the fact that they went on a vacation. Maybe people will be able to follow their GPS trace across America where they went on holiday. Now, the expectation is not that they'll use that GPS trace to work out whether they were in bars underage, and when the person who's now a Facebook friend later is a prospective employer. So maybe instead of saying, I'm going to limit to my friends, maybe, or friends of friends, which is a very, very sort of term, maybe I want to say, you can put this if you're interested in what sort of a holiday I had. But if you're a prospective employer, even if you are also a friend, from the point of view of employing me, you're not allowed to use that. So just as you're not allowed to use my race, color, or creed, or gender or sexual preference when employing me, I'd like to add to that the things I put on Facebook when I was a minor. And so generally, I don't think that's unreasonable. I think it's reasonable. I think in a way I'd be proud of MIT as an employer if they had a checkbox and said, we'll look at your Facebook stuff or we won't.
All right. You and I will bring that back to Cambridge, Mass. A great idea, and I hope you will all join me in thanking the panel for showing us the way forward. This is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.